Have you always dreamed about buying a house out in the country and living outside of town? In this video, we're going to talk about all the things you need to think about if you want to buy your dream house out in the country and get away from the city. So the first thing you want to think about when you're buying out in the country is how big you want your lot to be. You know, there's a lot of maintenance that goes on with bigger properties, obviously. And one of the things you need to think about is the equipment that will be extra cost, obviously, on top of the house, used to maintain bigger properties. So you might have to get a tractor or some kind of loader, or, you know, a big piece of mowing equipment if it's wide open and there's a lot to mow. So all of these things are things to think about depending on the size of your property and how much property you actually want. The other thing people don't really think about is they have this dream of living out in the country, but depending on how far out of town you are, it can be a long trip to go into town, to go to the store, to go to a movie, to go to a restaurant, whatever you want to do. You just need to keep in mind the distance. And if you have little kids that have to, you know, go to school, or you're taking them to sporting events, whatever it may be, you need to keep that in mind and think about that the price of fuel is going to add up, and it can be an awful lot of driving, and if that's not something you're used to or want to do, think about how far out of town you actually do want to live. Another thing that's a pro and a con for some people is when you're out in the country like this, especially out here, we have grizzly bears in this area. You're going to have grizzly bears, mountain lions, all kinds of different wildlife that you may not be used to if you're moving from the city. And, you know, grizzly bears are going to be rare, and you're probably not going to get attacked. But if you have animals and dogs, it's just things you have to think about, like leaving the dog food out, or bird feeders, or if you have fruit trees, things like that that can attract bears and other wildlife. Just one more thing to keep in mind when you're buying out in the country, especially here in Montana. So another thing you're not going to have out here is the regular infrastructure things that you'd have in town, like a sewer. You won't be hooking up to a sewer. You'll more than likely have a septic tank, and that's another thing you're going to have to do regular maintenance on. Also, your fuel source for your furnace, a lot of places use propane, so you're going to have a tank. You can either rent it or buy it from the propane company, and then they're going to come out and have to fill it, so you're going to want to do that in the fall so they don't come out in the middle, or don't have to come out in the middle of winter. And I've talked about this in other videos, the access to your property. If you're on a long driveway, or, you know, your own driveway, or you're sharing a driveway, there's different scenarios. There may be road agreements with the neighbors, or you may have to plow yourself. Obviously, we get a lot of snow up here in the winter, and that's one thing. Another piece of equipment you're probably going to need that you wouldn't need really in town is a snow plow, or a plow for the front of your truck, whatever it may be, in order to get in and out of properties out here in the country. Another thing to keep in mind is that if there's any zoning or covenants, like they have neighborhoods out here in the country. This particular house is on its own, but there are some places that will have some rules. So if you think you're just going to go out and do whatever you want, sometimes that may not be the case. So when you're looking, be sure to have your agent, if it's not me, check into that for you and make sure you can do everything you want to do on a property that's out here in the country, because just because you're out of town doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. There's still county zoning regulations. That comes into play a lot with the Airbnb or rental type properties. The county does have rules on that. You can't just do it because you're out in the country. So once again, another thing to take a look at, keep an eye on, and just make sure you're allowed to do everything you want to do in your property outside of town. And if you are in an area without any zoning or covenants, you may want to do a little research on the neighbors, because they may be taking full advantage of that and doing things with their property or on their property that you don't necessarily agree with, like shooting a whole bunch, or, you know, dumping a lot of junk around their property. These are all things that could affect your resale value, and these are all things that could affect your quality of life if you end up being next door to a guy that does a bunch of stuff that you don't agree with. And speaking of resale value, everything we talked about will kind of tie into that, because not everybody wants to live out in the country. So, you know, depending on how far out the property is, depending on what type of infrastructure you have there, if it's just a wood burning stove like you can see here, and no other heat source, that's going to affect financing for some people. And that's also going to create a lot of work for somebody to cut a bunch of wood, stack it, split it every year. It's a lot of work. I've lived in a house with a wood burning stove, and it definitely keeps you in shape. And it's you know, it's not convenient. A lot of people think of it as a romantic kind of cool thing to have, but until you actually have to feed wood into it all winter long and worry about when you're gone and things like that, it can be a pain, and that will tie into the resale value too. So keep that in mind, and everything we discussed when you're thinking about resale value of this house, because you may think you're never going to move and you found your dream place and it's just the greatest house ever, but the average time people stay in a house is 7 years. And so keep that in the back of your head. You know, when I talk about resale value, that's why, because more than likely, if you go by the averages, you're not going to be here the rest of your life, and you're going to end up selling it one day. And these are all questions and things that the buyers are going to look at before they purchase this house.
Thank you for watching our video. Please call, text, or email for more information. And don't forget to watch our other videos about Montana.